You're listening to Quantum Harry the Podcast, a podcast version of the book Quantum Harry, A Unified Theory of the Potterverse by B.L. Purdom. Episode 9. We're Here, We're Metaphorically Queer. In Episode 8, we began looking at the 7th major archetype in the Harry Potter series, the Liminal Being. Specifically, the Metaphorically Queer Liminal Being, the ruling archetype for Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. So if you missed Episode 8, you should definitely listen to that first. In this episode, we'll look at fanfiction, Squibs, the ideological other, why Harry was supposed to go to Stonewall High, and Dumbledore being both literally and metaphorically queer. Plus the reason for all of that camping in the 7th book, and, of course, the character best embodying the archetype ruling Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. Almost from the time the Potter books were published, readers have discussed sexual themes in the books and have written fanfiction, which feature same-sex relationships, usually 2 or more male characters or 2 or more female characters. One reason that these writers have often cited for representing Harry specifically as queer in stories is the queer-friendly subtext in the books. Technically, Rowling has written Harry as someone who likes girls, so much so that in Half-Blood Prince he is glad that Ron, his best friend, doesn't know about the fantasies he's having about Ron's sister. But while Rowling didn't write a Harry who is literally queer, she did use queer metaphors in reference to Harry and many other characters. Due to this pervasive sympathy for the metaphorical queer, finding a queer-friendly subtext isn't difficult. Unlike ethnic minorities, who are born into families in which everyone has the same background, barring cross-cultural adoption, sexual minorities are similar to Muggle-born wizards because they have an attribute that they don't share with their closest relatives. Before Harry goes to Hogwarts, he is literally closeted, in the cupboard under the stairs, until his true orientation is revealed by the Hogwarts letters, which make it impossible to continue to hide who he is, least of all from himself. Vernon wants to squash him down and deny him his power, but the letters are his coming out. Like a squib, a non-magical person born in a wizarding family, and like many queer youth, Harry is encouraged to be what he is not. We can even see how strongly J.K. Rowling objects to this type of magical repression outside of the original 7 Harry Potter books by looking at her script for fantastic beasts and where to find them. In contrast to the accidental magic Harry performs before he gets his Hogwarts letter, when he doesn't do anything that could be called even metaphorically monstrous, the trope called "Have you tried not being a monster?" fits the Obscurial and fantastic beasts very well. In the film, a woman who bears an uncanny resemblance to an anti-gay religious zealot, except that she's anti-magic, leads a group that wants to eradicate magical people from New York. This leads to a child in her care being worried about her finding out that he's magical, much like the young people in Diana Wynne Jones's Witch Week, another book with metaphorically queer characters that I cited in Episode 8. However, unlike Jones's witches, in Fantastic Beasts, extreme repression of this sort leads to the child becoming a dangerous force of destruction, an Obscurial. This side effect of magical repression has not been seen before in the 7 Harry Potter books, nor is the Obscurial in the school book bearing the same name as the film, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. But there is a scene in the film in which Newt Scamander explains Obscurials. Newt says, "There used to be more of them, but they still exist. It was before wizards went underground, when we were still being hunted by muggles. Young wizards and witches sometimes tried to suppress their magic to avoid persecution, so instead of learning to harness or to control their powers, they developed what was called an obscurus." Most wizards don't grow up in an environment in which they need to suppress their magic. They're either in families where at least one other person, like a parent, is magical, or they're in Muggle families where their relatives don't know about magic, let alone suppressing it. However, Squibs are born into wizarding families but are not magical, and once again, because they are outside the norm, this is not well regarded. Neville Longbottom's family is afraid that he may be a squib, and his great-uncle nearly kills him to prove otherwise. He wants to help Neville access his power, not cut him off from it, like Vernon with Harry, or like the boy in Fantastic Beasts, but we still get the impression that it's better not to be a squib. Like Harry, the squib Argus Filch finds refuge at Hogwarts. We know nothing of his early life, whether he was crushed by not getting a Hogwarts letter, for instance. The Quick Spell course, KWIK, that Harry finds in Filch's office is reminiscent of ex-gay programs or so-called reparative therapy, designed to de-gay someone, which has been roundly debunked by the AMA and medical organizations in many other countries. Filch seems to be a self-hating squib, constantly surrounded by kids who can do magic while he cannot. Doing magic would technically be normal for him, coming from a wizarding family, but he'll never be normal, so he's terminally unhappy and seems to believe solidly in misery loves company. The result is Filch abusing his power, such as it is, giving out detentions for relatively minor infractions, especially if he's feeling disgruntled, though he's only gruntled under Umbridge's regime. J.K. Rowling could have outed Sirius Black as queer if she wanted to thrill her fans to pieces. It may or may not be comforting to those fans to know that he's at least metaphorically queer, the ideological other in his family, because he doesn't believe in blood purity. Like many queer teens, he leaves home and chooses a new family, the Potters. But also like other queer teens, it's not a true choice for him to simply be who he is. In the final book, it's implied that Regulus isn't unlike Sirius, despite being a Death Eater who was sorted into Slytherin. Unlike his brother, Regulus remains closeted and works to steal a Horcrux, dying before he can destroy it. Rowling also depicts this ideological metaphorical queerness in other families, house elves and centaurs. After Harry frees Dobby, he starts wearing clothes, getting paid, and is now beyond the pale to other elves. But he was already pretty far from them ideologically before he was emancipated. Firenze the Centaur cannot return to his herd after he takes a teaching job at Hogwarts, which is a sharp departure from centaurs' strict separation from humans. Liminal beings by their nature, centaurs are similar to half-alien heroes, except that they're half-human and half-horse. They also see across barriers, like crones, and understand the meanings of omens. This is probably why, in many myths, a hero's teacher or mentor is often a centaur. The best fit as a teacher for a liminal being is also a liminal being. Whether a family is muggle, wizarding, dark wizarding, or magical creatures, someone who's considered abnormal for their family may be forcibly indoctrinated to be normal. If this fails, that person may be ostracized. Rowling always shows this in a negative light. The Blacks, the Dursleys, house elves, centaurs, and Neville's Uncle Algy do not invite our sympathy for abusing power and trying to change, or for not accepting, Sirius, Harry, Dobby, Firenze, and Neville, who isn't an actual squib. His family was just terrified that he might be. However, there are refuges for the other. Harry's refuge is Hogwarts. If he'd gone to Stonewall High, that might have been another refuge, given the name and the fact that Dudley was at a different school. The riot that occurred in 1969 at the Stonewall Bar in Greenwich Village in Manhattan is widely considered to be the watershed moment in the history of queer rights. That J.K. Rowling gives this name to the school Harry is supposed to attend is striking, especially considering other closeted imagery associated with him, plus Vernon's open hostility toward literal queerness, such as when he says that he's glad Dudley's marks at school aren't better, since he doesn't want a son who is, quote, some swatty little Nancy boy, unquote. Rowling never has Harry go to Stonewall or meet anyone else who does, so it seems extraneous to mention its name unless she wants readers to link it to queer rights. The only other Muggle schools mentioned in the books are Smeltings, where Dudley goes, and Eton, which, unlike Stonewall and Smeltings, is not fictional. But even though most Brits would refer to the nearest state school as the local comprehensive, Rowling calls it Stonewall High, going out of her way to give it this very meaningful and evocative name. Dobby and Firenze find a refuge at Hogwarts, and of course, Sirius finds it with the Potters. He isn't relegated to living on the street, an all too frequent fate for queer teens who leave home. Tom Riddle also finds refuge at Hogwarts, though his metaphorically queer experience is different from Harry's. He lives in an orphanage, an ad hoc family. We don't know if he began hurting other children after being rejected socially, or if he was rejected after exercising his power over others. However, we do know that he embraced his difference and felt that it made him superior to Muggles. J.K. Rowling only makes queerness literal for one liminal being, Albus Dumbledore. That he's metaphorically as well as literally queer is presented very subtly. He's not Muggle-born or forced to live with vehemently anti-magic Muggle relatives or in a Muggle orphanage. He isn't a squib or a suspected squib. He isn't a half-giant, a vampire, or a werewolf. He's closest to Sirius, Firenze, and Dobby, ideological metaphorical queers. The most brilliant wizard of the age has no peer, and after his mother's death, he's expected to put aside ambition to care for his family. Then he meets Gellert Grindelwald. Rowling's description of Albus's excitement on meeting Gellert, and the less subtle jealousy evident in Elphias Doge's memories of Dumbledore, tells us that he definitely found a kindred spirit, and can imply that he fell in love. Rowling hasn't said that there was more than friendship between Dumbledore and Doge, but there is suggestive subtext from Doge of his feelings for Albus. And then there's Aberforth's words about the two of them. He says of Doge, "He thought the sun shone out of my brother's every orifice, so make of that what you will." It's easy to draw a parallel from Albus's experience to queer youth who feel unique until they meet another queer person and realize that they are not alone. Albus and Gellert's kindred feelings are not necessarily sexual, so it's unnecessary for Grindelwald to be literally or metaphorically queer. The reveal of Albus's orientation and his attraction to Gellert does flesh out the backstory and puts into perspective his heartbreaking decision to stop the man he loved. This also provides insight on his awarding Neville points for standing up to his friends. Other characters not being labeled literally queer by Rowling isn't a shock. But given the pattern that she establishes in games being metaphors for war and love, and the way she repeatedly has mock wars segue into real wars, which I begin exploring in detail in the next episode, it's also not surprising that fanfiction authors extended her queer metaphors to the literal with characters who aren't Dumbledore. Harry's closeted life, Stonewall High, the similarity between sexual minorities and Muggle-raised wizards, werewolves, and animagi, among other things, lend themselves to the creation of these types of transformative fan works. Hagrid is liminal due to his half-giant heritage, and he's chagrined to be outed by Rita Skeeter's exposé in Goblet of Fire, which goes on about his bloodthirsty mother. Ron points out that Hagrid's being part giant wasn't exactly hard to figure out, and Hagrid's hostile response to Madame Maxime denying her half-giant heritage is similar to an out person who can't believe that someone they think is obviously queer is trying to pass for non-queer. Snape is another metaphorically queer liminal being, but until Harry sees the memories Snape gives him as he dies, we don't know how similar he is to Harry. Earlier, Harry saw a memory of James bullying Snape, and Harry identified with Snape, not with his father. In the memories Snape gives to Harry in Deathly Hallows, he sees bits of Snape's childhood with Lily and Petunia, including the moment that Snape gives Lily the gift of herself. He tells her that she's a witch. Like Dumbledore meeting Grindelwald, it's a moment when he's able to tell Muggle-born Lily that she's not alone. He's also magical. Besides having a witch mother and Muggle father, plus being a male incarnation of the crone, a female archetype, Snape also embodies the metaphorically queer liminal being as a spy. He is closeted, undercover as a member of the Order. If his cover is blown, his life is forfeit. He doesn't dare reveal his true orientation, a mission as dangerous as being a sexual minority in a country with the death penalty for this. The memories Snape gives Harry show the complete person he could never show to the world. Harry is a metaphorically queer liminal being who is not literally queer, but attracted specifically to Ginny Weasley, his female counterpart. Ginny is metaphorically queer herself, as the only Weasley girl born for many generations. She's treated differently by her family due to her gender. She has to sneak into the broom shed on the sly while she's growing up, taking out others' brooms to learn to fly and play Quidditch, which positions her as a female version of Harry when she takes his place in Quidditch matches. Harry and Ginny together comprise a complete entity, like the parts of a yin-yang, and one of the things they have in common is growing up in a setting where they're both metaphorically queer. There are a great many candidates for the character best embodying the archetype of the metaphorically queer liminal being in the 7th book. In Deathly Hallows, Remus Lupin and Harry share many similarities. Remus was bitten and turned into a werewolf as a child. In the 6th book, we meet the one who bit him, Fenrir Greyback, who specifically targets children, just as Harry was attacked by Voldemort as a baby. Greyback and Voldemort are symbolically the same. In Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf who tempts the maiden hero from her path is equal to the serpent in the Garden of Eden tempting Eve, which I'll talk about in more detail in episode 13. In the Norse tale of the end of the world, Thor fights the wolf called Fenris. Wolves and serpents fill the same roles in the Norse and Eden mythic landscapes. Harry and Remus collide with and become entangled with this type of villainous liminal being as children, and are determined not to be like the enemy who changes them, despite their similarities to their enemy. Like Harry, at Hogwarts the lives of Remus's friends revolve around his problems. They learn to be animagi to accompany him during the full moon. Being animagi makes each of the marauders liminal, though James is not also metaphorically queer, and Peter is only metaphorically queer once he secretly becomes a Death Eater and none of his friends know that he's actually serving Voldemort. In the 6th and 7th books, Remus is undercover with other werewolves, immersing himself in a world he'd previously avoided. Finally crossing the threshold into this world, he confronts this part of himself before his death. This is similar to Harry voluntarily entering Voldemort's mind, no longer shrinking from their connection. They both realize that it's better to understand the enemy, no matter how disturbing the process is, rather than forever fleeing the enemy and the part of them that's like that enemy. Bill Weasley is liminal but not metaphorically queer until he's attacked by Greyback in the 6th book. When Harry meets Bill in Goblet of Fire, he thinks he's cool, an Indiana Jones type guy, breaking curses on ancient tombs, which means he's crossing thresholds. He brings treasure back from these forbidden locations for Gringotts, like Harry getting the Philosopher's Stone from the Mirror of Erised. Like Dumbledore, Bill was academically talented, getting 12 OWLs, and he was head boy, like Tom Riddle. Unlike Harry and Remus, Bill doesn't have a childhood encounter with a wolf or serpent equivalent, but once he's attacked by Greyback, he joins their ranks, having survived this archetypal rite of passage. He was already a liminal being who crossed thresholds and linked worlds, but now Bill is a metaphorically queer liminal being because he's a bit dangerous, though less so than Remus and differently than Harry, who engages in treasure hunting of a sort, like Bill, when he's tracking down Horcruxes. But Harry isn't acquiring treasure for his own benefit or for an employer. He's trying to break a curse on the world itself, Voldemort. In Deathly Hallows, it's appropriate that Harry embarks on the bank job from Shell Cottage, the home of Bill Weasley, the treasure seeker and curse breaker who embodies the exact same archetypes as Harry, a youth and a metaphorically queer liminal being. Remus also comes to Shell Cottage before the bank job, putting these 3 characters with the same archetypes plus Dean Thomas, also a youth and metaphorical queer, in the same place at the same time. But Remus and Bill are not just youths with maidens, members of doppelganger couples for Harry/Ginny. They are metaphorically queer liminal beings who are doppelgangers to Harry as individuals. Remus is attacked by a monster who changes him, just as Voldemort changes Harry, and Bill is the treasure hunter who breaks curses, just as Harry hunts Horcruxes and breaks the curses on them. Dumbledore is dead at the end of the 6th book, but he's a significant presence still in the 7th. Harry's pursuit of Horcruxes makes him Dumbledore's surrogate, as in the 1st book. The bequests from Dumbledore also evoke his presence 3 times. First, when the trio hears the tale of the 3 brothers. Then, when the Deluminator brings Ron back to Hermione and Harry, which is immediately followed by Ron morphing from an ordinary wise old man into the Godfather variant of the wise old man, by pulling Harry from the water, saving him. And finally, Harry, like Dumbledore, chooses the moment and manner of his demise, just as a Master of Death should, using the Resurrection Stone inside the snitch Dumbledore left Harry in his will before Harry goes into the forest wearing Death's own invisibility cloak. Dumbledore is in Harry's so-called afterlife, and they have a conversation that may or may not be in Harry's mind, a conversation with himself, in other words. This emphasizes that, by the end, Harry and Dumbledore have become interchangeable. Dumbledore was the only one Voldemort ever feared. Harry now succeeds the old hero, and as Master of the Elder Wand, he is positioned to defeat the enemy. Harry's actions echo what the liminal beings Remus, Bill, and Dumbledore have done, but the character who best embodies the metaphorically queer liminal being in Deathly Hallows, into whose shoes Harry steps, is not an ally, but his enemy. Harry's mission is ultimately to return home, and the nature of the metaphorical queer archetype is to choose a new home and family, usually after being homeless. So the destination is paradoxically home and not home. Harry and Voldemort both know that they must go home to Hogwarts to accomplish their goals. Some fans were rather impatient with all of the camping in the 7th book, but this is the reason for it. The 7th book is ruled by the metaphorically queer liminal being, who is best embodied by the homeless Voldemort. And as a result, Harry is homeless in most of the book, once he, Ron, and Hermione have to abandon Grimmauld Place. From there until the end, Harry is homeless, only taking temporary refuge at Shell Cottage. He is inarguably a guest there. Bill does not offer to make it his new home. Voldemort has always been homeless. The orphanage wasn't truly his home, nor was the Gaunt Cottage, or the Riddle House in Little Hangleton, though he squatted there, nor is Malfoy Manor when he uses it for Death Eater meetings. The only home he has ever truly known is Hogwarts, a refuge Dumbledore refuses to him when he doesn't hire him to teach defense against the dark arts. Harry follows in Voldemort's footsteps during the entire 7th book, both because he's homeless and because he's tracking down Horcruxes previously hidden by Voldemort. A piece of Voldemort's soul is at Hogwarts. Harry's confident that he'll find the Ravenclaw Horcrux there. Through his scar, he sees Voldemort in Grindelwald's prison cell, learning that Dumbledore won the Elder Wand from Grindelwald, over which Harry has become master moments before, having taken Draco's wand from him. Once again, power that Harry doesn't pursue, mastery over the Elder Wand, is given to him without his asking. His goal when he takes the wands from Draco is to keep them from being used against him and his friends, just as he wanted to keep Voldemort from using the Philosopher's Stone. Harry again wins by disarming. He becomes master of Draco's former wand and the Elder Wand as a result. Rolling always leads the reader back to wholeness. A liminal being is by definition an amalgam. When someone rejects part of himself, such as Voldemort rejecting his Muggle side, that person is incomplete. It's like rejecting part of life, such as childhood or death. Rowling gives us two liminal, metaphorically queer, potentially complete people, Voldemort and Harry. But only Harry chooses completion. Voldemort murders the Riddles, rejecting his Muggle heritage, just as he rejects death and rejects anything linked to childhood. He chooses incompletion. Harry returning to Hogwarts is a completion. First, he crosses the threshold into the wizarding world when he's 11, returning each year to Surrey to complete the cycle. Then he leaves that home and Hogwarts, wandering in a literal and metaphorical wilderness in the 7th book, whose ruling archetype is the equivalent of George R.R. Martin's Stranger, the liminal being, one who is neither here nor there, neither mortal nor immortal, ordinary and extraordinary. In Deathly Hallows, Harry isn't just homeless, he's a fugitive, an enemy of the state, like the witches in Witch Week, and he exists in a kind of limbo until returning home to Hogwarts. Aberforth tells Harry to run, to embrace permanent incompletion like Voldemort. Harry rejects this incompletion and returns to Hogwarts, his emotional home. This paradoxically makes the already whole, liminal, metaphorically queer Harry, the boy who lived and the master of death, even more complete. You've been listening to Quantum Harry the Podcast, a podcast version of the book Quantum Harry, A Unified Theory of the Potterverse by B.L. Purdom. music heard on Quantum Harry is composed and performed by B.L. Purdom. To ask B.L. Purdom to be a guest on your podcast, send a Twitter direct message to @QHPodcast. Next time on Quantum Harry, Episode 10, All's Fair in War and Quidditch, in which we launch into Part 2 of Quantum Harry, A Unified Theory of the Potterverse, with a 2-episode arc examining the way games, toys, and fairy tales shape the narrative of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. I hope you'll join me.